Yes, yes, I remember it well. That was a very brave thing to do, but terrifying. Okay. Right, so good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, thanks for coming. Welcome to people online. It's our great privilege today to have Martin Griffiths with us, who I will introduce in a second. I have a few things to canter through before we get going. So first, I have to say welcome to the Sussex Development Lecture, which is run by the Institute of Development Studies. Obviously, that's where we are, in partnership with the School of Global Studies, the Science Policy and Research Unit, and the Centre for International Education at the University of Sussex. I have to do some housekeeping. It's very brief housekeeping, which is for those of us in the room, if the fire alarm goes off, it is not a practice. There are two fire exits. There's the door over there, and there's the door over here. So Martin's going to talk for about 25, 30 minutes. The rest of the time will be for questions and answers. We'll take questions from the room and questions online. Online, there is a chat function at the bottom of the Zoom. So please just type your questions into the chat, and we will monitor those. And a recording of this lecture will be available on the IDS website afterwards. So I guess it's quite difficult to summarize Martin's career because it has been illustrious and multifaceted. But Martin started his humanitarian work on the Thai-Burma border in 1979 for UNICEF, and has done pretty much every job in the sector since, rising to the most senior and significant position in our sector. You've been in leadership positions in Save the Children. You were the director of ActionAid. You started the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva. You were the UN's Special Envoy for Yemen. And then most recently, the Emergency Relief Coordinator and Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. And I think Martin is almost unique, or shares with Sergio Vieira de Mello the characteristic that you came from our sector and were in that position having worked for many years in our sector, unlike pretty much everybody else who's come from diplomacy or civil service.
No names.
And I think, no names. And I think that has given you a unique perspective on what is important. And I think those are the things that you're going to talk to us about today. I'd just like to say before Martin starts as well, he is now an honorary associate at the Institute of Development Studies, and we're absolutely super excited that that's the case. So that's it. That's my introduction. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to do it from here because you'll realize I'm standing up almost. Thanks a lot. That was very gracious, and I'm very privileged to be here. I just want to say a word, as I've mentioned before this lecture, that I came here 50 years ago to do a lecture to IDS when I was in ActionAid, as you've mentioned, and I was the president for a year of the Development Studies Association of UK and Ireland. By chance, I didn't know anything about it. And I came here, and I was absolutely terrified by the audience. You were all far too clever, and I escaped, and I'm hoping I will escape with my friends and son there later, away from your far deeper knowledge of the subject. So I speak to you with a lot of humility, which I think is right. I'd like to thank Peter Taylor. Is he here? Yeah. The director of IDS. I'm hugely honored to be the new honorary associate. Thank you, Lewis. We have known each other for some time. And the many faculty staff, and we've been meeting each other just before this. Thank you very much for this. And of course to Lewis, who I got to know quite well because he runs the evaluation and monitoring of the so-called flagship project, which is rather a project to get into touch with learning, not talking. As you know, we'll come back to that. I'm not an academic or policy expert. My life has been devoted in many different ways to operations. As you said, I was a frontline aid worker in 1979 in the biggest crisis at that time. And it stands me well because it means that I can understand, I hope, a little bit about the rigors that everybody's going through these days. Every big complex operation has similar lessons to learn, including the suffering of the people, the stress that comes from that, the extraordinary stress that humanitarian aid workers feel as a result. And I think Gaza, by the way, I think I've said this publicly, Gaza is an example of the most difficult situation for humanitarian workers because they're failing every day. We know this, especially now with the extraordinary blockade of aid. And they feel it terribly, and they're doing triage, which is a terrible, terrible obligation and burden on them. And we have not yet seen the consequences in terms of PTSD, in terms of suffering, in terms of psychological suffering of those people. I've had a lot to do with them in the past, and I admire them hugely. The title of my lecture, a bit clever, is Humanitarian Diplomacy in a World Gone Mad. I'd like to say a few words, not too much, on the world gone mad, and then talk in more detail about this concept that we've been discussing of humanitarian diplomacy, which is neither new nor old, but is probably greatly misunderstood, and I'm associated with it in many ways. A world gone mad first, just to trot through these. Conflict is on the rise, we all know this. It's doubled in the last 5 years. It's becoming more violent, less easy to resolve, less dialogue, less principled mediation. Political instability, far-right extremism, we see it all the time, is resurging. The election of President Trump is not a welcome point in this regard. The unraveling of NATO, the extraordinary way in which the Ukraine war is being addressed. I had a significant part in the Ukraine Black Sea Agreement, is all testimony to the chaos of how to manage politics, political views, radical views, and the resolution of conflicts, but then on to our humanitarian issues. We face, as we hear every day, an existential threat to European security. It's sad to me, I'm sure it is to most of you, that the British government has decided to fund the necessary defense spending with raiding the cupboard of humanitarian and development aid. It's an easy one to do. It's the wrong thing, in my view, and I think many of us have said it. But it's testimony, isn't it, to this sense of disaster and crisis, the European war that Mr. Trump has been talking about, World War III, as he kindly put it. China, on global influence, is sitting there thinking this is a good time, and they're not wrong, and they've been very smart, I think, about multilateralism, which they support in their own way, but it's important. It's interesting to me that China is also seeking a mediation role. I'm also a mediator as well as a humanitarian in Myanmar, where they have seen the ravages, particularly the criminal gangs who exist in the ethnic areas, and China is seeking to play a positive role, but I'm not sure they know exactly how to do it. The Global South, quote, unquote, and we've been talking about this today, hugely important for us here in Brighton in IDS. The rising powers of the Global South. In my community, the humanitarian community, we know very well that there needs to be a reset, there needs to be a new way of doing business, there needs to be a new accountability, and it has to essentially understand, as a first step, what the Global South demands on us. Because, of course, the West and the North has been eroded, if that's the right word, by the situation in Ukraine, and probably rightly. But actually, there's still not a formal managed system for engaging with the Global South, and I hope that's something that we can do together. Of course, it will question the 1945 ideals of multilateralism and international cooperation, but it's actually more important than that in a way. That's what we have managed to benefit from. The new world order is going to be something that we don't really know. Impunity, we've all seen that. International norms, legal frameworks, judicial systems, are in trouble. I was asked by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to provide some deposition of evidence, which would be useful for his proceeding through the chamber to get the indictment on Netanyahu and Hamas. You remember that thing? And I was told not to do it, but he was right. He was right. And thank God he's there. And thank God he's actually spreading his wings. We need it, don't we? And you know, he's a UN institution, for God's sake. State commitments is eroding. We see it in this country, we certainly see it in America. And we look in a faltering way to the Gulf, complicated subject, and to the global South for telling us what global commitments might look like. And we don't know because we haven't asked and we haven't listened. And, you know, Lewis's shtick is generally to listen. Then there is the absence of global mediation. I've spent as much time as a mediator as a humanitarian. And what I've learned from the humanitarian community in the last 6, 9, 8, 10 months is they stand alone in these conflicts. On the whole, apart from the big ones, there's no mediation going on. There's certainly no principled mediation, which I think is mediation without interests. So we have a decline in that for geopolitical reasons, and the decline, therefore, in the pacific resolution of conflicts, which is vital to us in the humanitarian community. And look at the terrible pictures we all saw of the Oval Office with Mr. Zelensky, Mr. Trump, and Mr. Vance. I mean, it was a horrific moment for the world, not just for those in the room, or some of them. But it's all about publicity driving values, obviously. And that's become a signature point of the process to try to end the Ukraine war. It's all about public posturing and statements. And we all know from previous experience, including me, the one thing you do in trying to resolve a conflict is to keep quiet. Do it in the darkness because compromises are necessary. Obviously, multilateralism is under attack. The UN is in a terrible place. It's probably going to get worse as the US administration will engage with it, probably defund it. Certainly the Council, Security Council is going to be a nightmare. I'm glad I'm not there. Now, all that, we know that well, and now what do we do about that? Humanitarian diplomacy. It's an old concept, as I said earlier. It's not new. It's been around for many, many decades. But it's become a bit of a fad, I think, these years. I've been part of that faddishness. I have defined it in the back of an envelope, but it needs really to be carefully studied. My definition is following: three elements. Number one, mediation, political mediation and conflict resolution has got to be part of humanitarian diplomacy. Very uncomfortable for many humanitarian organizations who fear politicization, but essential because ending wars is as important as providing aid. And the humanitarian community has an obligation, in my view, I'll come back to it, to provide ground truth ideas to the mediators to know what is a priority. You know, in the Sudan mediation in Jeddah, I was sitting in Jeddah when it started, you know, a year ago. I wasn't let in, you know, as a threat. But it was all about humanitarian issues. No humanitarians were allowed to be part of it. Humanitarian issues are always the first thing. Look at Ukraine now. But we need to influence that, and we need to make it genuine, focused, and adequate. And that means our people, our community, you and others need to be in the room. The second thing is humanitarian negotiation. You know, not new. Access negotiation, incredibly important, extraordinarily difficult in the world today. Again, Sudan is a poster boy, but look at Gaza. Look at the shock of what's happening in Gaza at the moment. And again, the humanitarian community needs to use the principles of leverage that are apparent in political mediation to help their negotiation, to help our negotiation. And if you look at Sudan, that's not worked. They have all these governments involved in the Alps group, so-called, to try to get access and cross-border. But they're different from Emirates to Saudi to the US to others. Their different powers are not being used coherently and cogently to bring about change. And we see this daily, and it's a disaster, and we see famine coming. Thirdly, so we have conflict mediation, humanitarian negotiation, and thirdly, advocacy for humanitarian principles. It's impossible now for humanitarian organizations not to say something or contribute something to the international advocacy against impunity, against the breaches of humanitarian law. On the whole, in my experience, we have dodged away from this because we leave it to human rights people. They can judge it. We have another thing to do. We deliver aid. That's not good enough anymore. And so all of these things need to break down silos. They need to use partnerships. We're not going to do mediation. That's for the mediation people, but we need to inform them. We need to use advocacy humanitarian principles in a smart way, probably asking others to lead the fire, like International Court of Justice, Human Rights Watch, and so forth. But we need to engage in it. No longer is it possible for humanitarian agencies to keep their head down, focused on their delivery of aid. And actually, the fact is, as we were saying earlier, that this is no longer a choice. This is an obligation. You know, time up to my people. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, just a quick example of that. Lewis, I was the mediator for the UN in the Black Sea Grain Initiative back in 2023, I think it was. And it was interesting because it was a negotiation between Ukraine and Russia in the hardest times of war. And they both said, Ukraine and Russia both said to me as a mediator, they said, we can only do this because it has a global welfare, i.e. humanitarian cover. You know, it was useful to both, obviously, which is essential, but it had a cover story which allowed them to engage with their enemy. Humanitarian diplomacy can embrace this kind of cover, and we need to know more examples and opportunities as we go forward. Underfunding, we all know this. You know, I live in Geneva, where huge numbers of people are being let go, and across the world, especially, as Lewis would know better than me, in countries of need, where people are just being let go, AIDS victims have no support, and it's a random, tragic, wrong process. And I think, as we were saying, we need to address this with a theory of change, a theory of new obligations for the humanitarian community on behalf of the people. That's not happening yet because, of course, humanitarian leaders are focused on the cuts, understandably, but it's got to change by the middle of the year. We also need to understand, which we have known for years but have never really coped with, how donors tell us what to do. Yeah, it's becoming more and more obvious, okay? I mean, it's very obvious now. It's been obvious, frankly, in many different ways for years. And we have kind of avoided it because we get the money and we run and we fund large programs around the world. But it's not going to stand up in this world, especially not in the context of a move to the global south in terms of accountability and business model. And what Lewis is leading, which is the complete fundamental rearrangement of humanitarian programming to make it frontline community-led, listening-led. There's going to be a need for humanitarian agencies to engage with each other. You know, we're going to have to close down, they will have to close down some, they have to merge. So there's a massive reform issue, and I think that we can do this together because IDS has a unique quality. It's not got baggage, it's got a great international reputation, and it's a place of great learning. So I'm hopeful that we can do this together. We need to build a new model for humanitarian development aid. We need to make listening to local communities a central proposition of that. We're doing this together in the flagship project. We need to emphasize partnerships between mediators, human rights organizations, humanitarian organizations, so that we don't mission creep into their areas, right? Because that would politicize it. But we inform each other of the issues. And by the way, in a very practical way, that we inform each other of the psychology of the leaders of conflict. Mediators get a different view, humanitarian agencies get a different view, but they don't share it. What will drive al-Shara, for example? And it's super important for all of us to understand it without judgment, but also to understand it as part of our policy and programs. So the partnership is huge. And also I think, and I'm almost there, Lewis, also leverage. Leverage is an issue which is very familiar to the mediation community. As I remember from my time in the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and in Yemen, it was all about leverage, getting the right government to say the right thing. It's not worked in the humanitarian area quite so well. We need to understand the propensity of governments, the Emirates, obviously, in Sudan, what they're actually prepared to do to instruct their allies or clients. And I believe that the UK government is also managing a process with other countries to study leverage and to see how it could be better applied. So partnership and leverage, transforming negotiation. I think, finally, then I'll come and be cross-examined. The Institute of Development Studies is a global truth and a global leader. You have learning, you have analysis, you have disinterest. You're not following anybody's agenda. And in this situation today, we need you. Because I don't think we can rely on the humanitarian leaders, my friends, your friends, to come forward with disinterested examples of how this needs to be changed. You can, because of your access, because of your scholarship, and because of the need. I think IDS is very well placed. I've never been a fan of research and scholarship, as my son. Reading is a very difficult thing. This is the time for it. This is the time for it. And a combination of operational influence and scholarship and truth and study is now no longer avoidable. I thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So I have the privileged position of being able to start the cross-examination.
Yeah,
I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then throw it to the audience. And I think we're all extremely excited that you're here, and really important to hear that vision laid out. And I think for me, you touched on two things that are super important there and connected. This issue around fundamentally so much humanitarian need is driven by conflict. And the crisis of impunity that we are seeing in conflict is exacerbating that. And if we are to tackle humanitarian need, then we need to tackle conflict. We need to understand how, in those places where we can reduce conflict, mitigate conflict, and even resolve conflicts. I think you spoke very eloquently about that. And I think the other thing that you spoke very eloquently about is the need for our humanitarian system to evolve away from one where donors with the money tell us what to do and the big agencies do it, to one where genuinely communities express their needs and we deliver on those. A humanitarian system that is much more about responding to people's needs as they see them, rather than as we see them. So probably the first difficult question is, we know this humanitarian system is in crisis right now. The sudden collapse or withdrawal or act of vandalism against USAID, but also cuts in other donor agencies have left us very much in crisis. As you say, staff being laid off across the world in some of the most, some of the places that need them the most. Do you think that the system as it is can rise to the challenge ahead of it? That despite all of these cuts, there is something within the system that can use what's left and reorient. I guess I'm asking you, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist about what lays ahead for us in the next year or so?
Yeah, it's a glass thing, isn't it?
Glass half empty, yeah, glass half full.
I've wondered a lot about this, Lewis, like you have, and had lots of anxieties, sort of early morning anxieties about whether indeed the system will produce the new evolution. And I've assumed, pessimistically, that it won't. We see no real efforts from the United Nations and its agencies at the moment to change. I know from personal inquiries with some of those leaders that they understand the need. But there's no system or process or obligation to get them out of the gate and to actually talk about this. They're mostly frightened, which is understandable, about the retaliation which comes with it. I'm on the board of an international NGO, which was a very vocal one, and which deliberately kept very quiet about the huge cuts that they were making and not criticizing USAID disruption because they didn't want to be retaliated against. But then what they realized, and this goes to the heart of your question, I think, is this. They realized that it's not enough to tell somebody who's a schoolyard bully that we kind of understand and we'll cope with it and we'll deal with it. You have to stand up eventually for your rights. If we fail to make our advocacy about the mission that's been there for so many decades, then we will fail, because when times change, we'll be judged by our adaptation and acquiescence. So we need to express clearly our advocacy, which it must be simple, united, and so forth. That's the first thing. And it's not there yet. You know, we know that it's not there yet. Everybody's laying off huge amounts of people. They have the reason for people we serve not to say more. I don't think that's going to work. The second thing is that I don't think we can reasonably expect the humanitarian community and the Interagency Standing Committee, which I chaired until, middle of last year, to come up with a solution. It's too difficult. There are too many obligations as employers and rivals and competitors and fundees. I think, therefore, but I think they're aware of it. I don't think they're there yet, as you know. I think we're waiting for the middle of the year before the cuts have to go through for them to focus on the new reality of the future. I think what we need to do outside the system, but knowing it and knowing the people, is to provide them in a formal, independent way with the ideas about what reform would look like. Because it's not out there. I haven't read anything about what new reform would really look like. There's a lot of speculation. It's difficult, for God's sake, and it jettisons and threatens lives. But we need to provide that, and we're better than with you.
Fantastic. So I'm going to ask two more questions. One again, deep and difficult, and one less so. Well, no, maybe slightly more optimistic. I mean, over my much shorter humanitarian career, I think I have been privileged to see the emergence of a huge number of really inspirational local and national humanitarian organizations. I think in the last, I mean, they were always there, but there are more and more of them. And I see leaders in all of these crisis-affected countries who embody the values that I think we all aspire to. Conversely, does that give us cause for optimism? I mean, I realise that's kind of a leading question.
No, but it's a good question. I remember when we started the flagship project, which you're monitoring and evaluating and overseeing. This was a project which OCHA started in my time to focus on frontline listening as the means to determine priorities. What a new idea was that, right? I remember talking to one humanitarian leader who said, well, they're going to get a tent anyway, I mean, that's what warehouses are full of. So it's not simple, but you and others, Lewis, made it an important value-based reality. And interestingly, it was not pushed back by major donors at the time. It was accepted because it's right, it's obvious, it's not a difficult discussion. And as you say, there's more and more and more talent and resources and access and assets in the front line. And we all know, I know, you know, because we talked about it, that once you start listening the light bulb moment happens, doesn't it? And you realize, oh, that's it. That's what we need. Because people are sensible about their own priorities and we don't need to patronize them. What I think is going to be really, really difficult, that's back to the blueprint idea, is dealing with the supply chain issue. You know, that's a big deal because it's not just food, it's other matters. Des McNamara is here, former senior representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and he's done a lot of good in his life, I think. But he knows you know the system very well, Dennis. It's not going to be easy to move the supply chain to responding to the views on an average day of the frontline communities. It's a difficult thing. And we knew when we started the flagship project that it would be good in principle at the beginning, but then as we came closer to actually understanding what we were being told, I want a road, not a clinic or whatever. Huge benefit to the nexus, of course, by the way, we can both participate in that. But we knew that for the humanitarian system, major challenge, and we haven't got to that yet. I am confident, oddly, in a sort of silver lining approach, that this terrible calamity and crisis that we're facing will actually make that realization, that change more likely. Because frankly, we can't afford it anyway. Look at the cuts to the World Food Programme, the major recipient of food aid from America, and suffering hugely as a result of current things. So I think the system is going to change anyway. And what we need to do together is to make sure that it changes in the way that benefits people, not governments.
Thanks, Martin. Right. So I'm asked by my colleagues here. I'll go to questions after this one. Right. So I'm asked by my colleagues here to say, you were at Sussex University as a student. What changes have you seen coming back?
Well, of course, the campus is exactly the same. I was here, guys, in 1969. You know, I came here because this was the university at that time which nationalized the banks 3 times a week in the student. And that was my world. In fact, I was considered a right winger because I was a pacifist, not a Marxist. And I loved it. And I was an absolutely crap student. And but I loved the place and I loved the people. And what I know it partly through Sasha, is the extraordinary way in which Sussex has kept to its faith on looking after students in a very, very profound way, as well as its values, in a world gone mad. And so I think Sussex is a major achievement of its leadership, of its students, as well as important for the future. I'm delighted to be here for that after these many years. Delighted to have the future of my family here as well.
Great, thanks, Martin. Right, so we're going to do questions. I'm going to take 3 from the audience here, and then hand over to Martin to answer. Then 3 from the online audience, and we'll just keep going until we run out of time. So, gentlemen at the back with your hand up, sir, and then Philip. I'm sorry, I'm going to ignore you for madam at the back in the yellow hoodie, if that's all right. And Philip, I will come to you the second round tomorrow. Sir.
Yes, my name's Richard Longhurst, and I'm a research associate here at IDS. Thank you, Martin, for such a intensive presentation so far, and thank you for keeping it short so that we can all have a really good discussion. So I wanted to ask, is the old chestnut of integrating humanitarian development work dead, or does the situation that you've talked about, listening mode, provide new opportunities?
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, I should have recognised you. So, sir, and then we're going to go, madam, and then we'll go for questions.
Yeah, hi. I'm a Sussex graduate from about the same time as you. So hi, nice to see you. You've changed.
We've been advanced together in the past.
You started off by commenting on what the government has done with regard to aid, and I find it outrageous. You could say it's down essentially to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and we are having to trade off benefits to our own population to fund, warfare, defence in Ukraine, and I find that outrageous. But to cut to cut aid is equally outrageous because it's more needed elsewhere. What would you have done?
I'm coming into power in the next government. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Nimi Hoffman. Thank you for a wonderfully thoughtful and frank conversation. You noted
Sorry, can't quite hear you.
You noted the importance of listening to the Global South and to the people who are primarily served by humanitarian aid. And you also noted that there is a problem with the donor funding model.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you, have you considered listening more closely to the people of the Global South who have been pushing quite hard for tax justice and not aid? So for taxation and the stopping of illicit financial flows from the Global South to the Global North instead of aid. And then the question of whether the humanitarian sector can actually get behind that push.
Thank you.
Yeah,
good. Right.
Shall I try? I'm one of those who, like you, ma'am, was saying, is that I don't see why humanitarian and development aid should be a voluntary contribution. We've gone through the fossil fuel tax, we've gone through the Cobin tax, we've gone through assessed contributions to the UN. It's never worked because it hasn't been given somehow the place in the world's future that it should have. Of course, I'm biased. So I'm hugely in favor of tax, more than just, charity, essentially, isn't it? Because charity, as we have learned, donor funding is based on interests which can go wrong. Obligations, less so. The big threat to the UN these days, of course, is the commentary from Washington, DC, that they'll cut their assessed contributions and they'll basically put the lights off, which they can. I don't think that's an unrealistic prospect. So yes, I think among the differences that we will need to see in the so-called blueprint of change, we need to look at the mode of funding, because it ain't working, is it? And needs are going up, and funding is going down, and we've been wailing about it through my last few years, and it ain't changing. So we're failing every day. It's back to the problem for our colleagues in the field who are deciding who lives and who dies on those days, and that's a patronizing as opposed to a proper relationship to need, isn't it? So the white saviors are still active around the world because of the form of funding. So let's talk about the different levels and aspects and elements of new funding. Ukraine. Well, I did a lot of work in Ukraine, and I was appalled by what the government here did when they decided to raid the locker of aid without thinking of alternatives. It was the easy option. But it's not the easy option, because soft power, I'm not being sentimental, right? Soft power, which comes through humanitarian aid and understanding and learning and listening, is incredibly powerful. The idea that security only comes through defense actions, I think we put that away a long time ago. And I have colleagues who are military people in this country who are agreeing with that. So I get the fact that we're very worried about defense. Mr. Trump has forced us to do this in Europe. I get it, obviously. But it's not an either or, it's a both and, isn't it? And frankly, I don't get the point that was made by the government in quickly doing this aid cut. I think, postponed to 2027 without an assessment of impact. That's not accountable to the population. By any standards, we wouldn't allow that elsewhere. The nexus, this is Richard, isn't it? The nexus issue. I was on a panel, when I was head of OCHA these past 3 years, I was on a panel in New York on the nexus with Achim Steiner, I'm very proud to say we never met. It was an absolutely disastrous approach to the Nexus. You know, you would know, Richard, more than me, but you can imagine what a, you know, the dancing that all the interested parties, member states and others would do. And that's why when we talked, but also from my earlier life in development, actually, I started as a development professional in UNICEF, was to say, let's let the frontline communities tell us, partly because they know best, also because they have bragging rights. And it's a correlation, it's a corroboration, which should drive the international response. As I said earlier, it needs to have agencies operate in a different way, but it's hugely valuable as a advocacy tool. Difficult because host governments probably won't like what they're saying, and you know we can't all build roads and stuff. But we need to be sitting there, and you know Lewis and I have talked about this. We need to be, quote unquote, in a schematic way, sitting in front of these communities in these key countries, listening, not talking, but with development agencies. Development agencies seem to get a pass by not being present. You cannot have that. You know, they seem to get away with it. I don't get it. Donors stop development funding so quickly. And I've said to many of them, when Sweden, I think, stopped development funding a year or two ago, I said, that's not good news, you know, for us. We need it. Syria, no development funding. Afghanistan, no development funding. It's wrong. So we need to have them present as real partners, not on a panel. And I think they're open, you know, why wouldn't they be open to it? It's the right thing. A different way of doing business.
Very good. Right, so I'm going to go online. Gary, can you read us out three questions? Thank you.
This is from John. Do you have views on calls that humanitarian and development funds should be diverted to slavery reparations? This is from Akif. Should the UN reform or abolish the veto power to ensure a more democratic and impartial decision-making process in international peace and security matters?
Yeah.
And this is...
I agree. Consider it done. Yeah.
This is from Harim. How can humanitarian programming remain effective and accountable in crisis-affected regions as USAID and UK aid scale back foreign development aid?
I'll go for that.
Yep.
Look, I'm not an expert on slavery reparations, but I would just say this. We have a bad enough time in the humanitarian and development aid budget context to try to focus our minds on what we need to do. We don't claim that it's the only important thing. On the contrary, these other things, like you're saying, Gary, are more important. But we should try to focus on advocating for our needs. That's what we're here for. That's what we're paid for. And that's what people expect of us. So I would, aid programs, you know, in this country, I think I'm right. The government aid program was also a basis for paying for refugee support in this country, wasn't it? It took a lot of aid out. Well, we obviously need to provide support to refugees, but why loop this program for that program? I'm not a fan. The veto. Look, I sat in that council, Security Council, you know, many times, 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes, listening to the veto problem. And we've seen it so clearly. The recent, you know, US-Russia resolution on, or combination on Ukraine, the way in which Russia vetoed a suggestion for aid to Sudan, the way in which US vetoed debate on Gaza, all tells us this is not fit for purpose. It's not. It's old. And I don't think it'll change. That, I think, is part of the much more serious problem of the future, because we're still in 1945 and we shouldn't be. Why should Britain have a veto, for God's sake? France. Yeah, so you know we shouldn't go a lot. We need to change the world bit by bit, Gary, I think, and that is one of the things we need to come to. But I'm not very optimistic. My wife was involved as an aide to the President of the General Assembly in '97 doing a lot of work on reform of the Security Council. It didn't work then. There's been a lot of work since, as you know. US has actually been, well, the earlier US was quite progressive, but it led to nothing. I don't think we should be held back by the appalling record of the Security Council. I remember saying a lot to the Security Council members when they used to ask me, what can we do to help you? I was a humanitarian. I said, do your job, please, and let me do mine. You know, they're supposed to provide peace and security, and it's not humanitarian. And I think as you know, they found a refuge, if you like, in humanitarian. And the third question, sorry.
I think you answered it. Did I answer it? Yeah.
I answered it.
Yeah. Very good. Right. So I'm going to come back to the room. So I have Philip from before, and then Katharina, and then Sir with the blue shirt. Sorry, and then I'll come to you next time round. I won't forget.
Thank you for the talk, Martin. Hopefully it's not a too difficult question, but when you're discussing impunity, I mean, one aspect of impunity is killing aid workers or blocking access. But related to, but different to impunity is a crisis that I see in the aid system now around credibility, legitimacy, hypocrisy, complicity, these things. So that can be, and that takes different forms. So that can be, in 2022, Ukraine was 80% funded, Sudan was 20% funded, right? And then alongside of that, you also then have the spectre, for instance, of airdrops in Gaza that we all know is not an efficient way to deliver aid.
Yeah.
And the people doing that, who funded one of those airdrops, was the US, who were also funding the weapons, which to many people, that's a very simple, very simplistic hypocrisy, but it's what they think of when they think about the crisis of the aid system now, especially because of Ukraine and Gaza occurring at the same time. So the question is, sorry, what do we do about it?
Move on.
Very good. Katharina.
Thanks. Katerina Lenner from the University of Bath. Thanks a lot for the talk. And I also wanted to pick up on this thread of discussing, the need to challenge impunity and ask about your thoughts on the need to challenge neutrality as a humanitarian principle. So if we think, given the state of the world, is it necessary not just to challenge the one, but also to challenge neutrality as a principle, particularly given that also if we think about who are humanitarian workers today, the overwhelming percentage of humanitarian workers globally are local workers who might have a very different sense of what their humanitarian values are, and neutrality might not be core among them. And so if we question neutrality as a principle, what could that give way to? Would it be a language of human rights, a language of law, or could it also be a language of solidarity replacing that?
Thank you. And gentleman with the blue shirt.
Thank you. Luke from Tier Fund. Clearly, funding has reduced drastically, and we could have the conversation about when it might come back up. I guess my question is, where do you think future funding is going to come from? Could it come from the private sector? Could it come from local sources? And then the second half of the question is, who do you think is going to be spending this money in the next 10 to 20 years? Is it going to be multilaterals, or is it going to be smaller organisations based in countries where the response is?
Good, so it's a very straightforward question.
That's easy. The hell with you guys, right? I gotta go now.
You did say it was grilling.
Yeah, I know. So, complicity, hypocrisy, double standards, airdrops, crap, and we all know it. And it's the compromises. I think you were saying also, wasn't it, the compromise between humanitarian decisions and donor political requirements, not just donors, right? In the case of Jordan and US who did the airdrops. It's really important, I think, Philip, as you know best, because it's undermining our value being the humanitarian value. We're seen as part of a Western project, of course, which go back to, I think, your point too. And we're seeing as complicit in double standards. The funding for Ukraine, which is massive, has led to that too. I don't think the humanitarian agencies should not have taken that money, but they're very vocal about the consequences, as I was. It's not a new thing, but it's a very much more clear thing, I think, these days, isn't it? And that's why I think that humanitarian advocacy on impunity and other things is so important. And on the whole, most humanitarians have stayed away from this, leaving it to the human rights community, the courts of justice and international court. I did the opposite after the Gaza war started, because I was propelled into making a strong set of statements about what I think was wrong with what Israel was doing. And you don't see it so often now. You know, there's equivocation. I think it's a false option, because if you don't stand up for what we believe in, you won't be believed when you do. So it's okay to accommodate the US administration. Is it? But what happens when we get a new one and so forth? So I think it's fundamental we stick with our values and we speak up, and advocacy by humanitarians as well as human rights people, but you know, carefully shared and so forth, is going to be critically important. It'll be a sea change. You know, it's interesting, it's interesting that humanitarian agencies, which are known for advocacy, and Oxfam and HCR and others for their advocacy, OCHA in a certain way, somehow also wary of speaking out about these issues, because they say it'll be threatening to our donor base, we won't serve the people we need. It's a wrong assumption. Back to the blueprint, I think. I wouldn't challenge neutrality. I'm really keen that we stick with the laws we've got. We won't be able to implement them properly at IHL and so forth. We do need to make solidarity a part of our operational principle, hence the stuff that you're doing, Lewis. Solidarity is not a bad thing. It's different from a lack of neutrality. We have an obligation to be associated with the people that we serve, in the awful phrases, and we need to make that visible. We need to make them our partners. We need to make them our advocates, and so forth. Solidarity, my former boss, Mr. Guterres, uses it all the time. As you know, I mean, he's from that tradition. It's not a bad thing, but neutrality, I would be very careful, because if we ditch neutrality, especially now, when it will frankly be looked at as an accommodation of Western funding, we'll be in serious trouble, and rightly so, I think. So it's a management thing. Funding is reduced terribly, but perhaps less surprisingly than we imagined. We never really thought that this guy would go out and maraud like he has done. We all wake up in the morning, I think, these days, wondering what on earth happened overnight. And it's never really good, is it? So where's it going? I think, first of all, you know, UNRWA was telling me, UNRWA, the refugee Palestinian organization, was telling me the other day that their income from private sector has hugely gone up, much more than they hoped, much more than they even asked, because of the solidarity that, back to your point, ma'am, the solidarity that people, ordinary people across the world, feel about suffering and passion. So, and I'm fundraising at the moment for my organization, and so I know that you can't do it without major investments in private sector. It's always been that, hasn't it? But it's more pertinent now, because we need a new business model. The second thing is, of course, as we always say, the Gulf needs to give money. It's interesting in Syria, in the thing in Brussels on Tuesday, I think, the Syria pledging meeting. Qatar, US, Saudi, Emirates didn't pledge. Quite, perhaps not surprising, but quite shocking, because they don't want to give it to a multilateral. They need more recognition, as we know. So I'm not sure that's a refuge for us. We obviously need to, I spend a lot of time in the Middle East, so we obviously need to sort of keep pushing. I think the answer but it's a reform answer, not a funding answer. And it's what this man passionately believes in, is the plethora of local organizations. What we need to strip away, as you know, we all know, is the way in which the big agencies strip away the commissions as it goes down towards local organizations. Convenient for the big donors, they just give it to, you know, a big agency, UN agency, usually international NGOs actually. And then, you know, finally it gets to people who, some of whom may claim to be local and aren't, you know, all that. That's a big issue and a big part of any blueprint for reform. And it's, we've all known this, I think. We've all known this for many years as to why that's important. But we've gone along with the system. So I think localization is a refuge, it's a salvation, it's a salve, but we need to fashion it in a way that's realistic.
Back to the online, please, Gary.
Okay, this is from Tina. Do we have the right leadership to drive through these ambitions of negotiation, partnership and advocacy? And do you believe there is a real buy-in, and who should lead it? This is from Akif. How can the ICC maintain its credibility and effectiveness when it issues arrest warrants against powerful leaders but lacks the enforcement power to bring them to justice? And this is from Mohammed, watching from Afghanistan. My question is, what roles do regional actors and neighbouring countries and regional agencies play in influencing and shaping humanitarian diplomacy within a given country? For example, Afghanistan experiencing political instability and controls by armed groups.
Okay.
Thanks, Gary.
Well, obviously leadership. What can I say? You know, we're here. Let me make 2 points about leadership, because it's critically important. We all know this in every sector, not just this sector, every sector. Leadership is crucial and often is not satisfactory. Humanitarian leadership, there's a lot of people, my former colleagues, who are first rate at humanitarian operations. They know the system, they've grown up in it. Philippa Grandi has been in UNHCR since, you know, the fall, and so forth. So Nibby Kane is an amazing leader in WFP, but SAVE, ActionAid, and the others, Oxfam, and so forth. And then the local communities that we were just discussing, and the local leaders, which we need to know more about. So leadership is crucial, but what I think is important to distinguish as to whether they have the freedom, the ones who run the humanitarian agencies, to tell the future of the world. And I'm slightly saying that I think they're very, you know, it would be very brave if they do, and it would be great, and I know they will support change, but I think it's a lot to ask them to get out the gate in advance of what might be reformed, because they're managing, all of them, managing huge staff numbers, managing appalling cuts, unprecedented and misunderstood. We need to help them. So I think the issue about leadership, we've got good leadership, we need to help it. And that's what we're going to do together. ICC. Well, I think it's delightful that ICC stepped out of the gate and issued those arrest warrants. I think that was a moment of real, you know, leadership again, courage. I don't think it's judged by the fact that it's not going to be realized. I think we have a long history of ICC warrants, which actually do exist and do exist indefinitely and are important. We need the world to have a conscience. Not necessarily because it's going to work, but because we need the world to have a conscience. And I was amazed by what they're doing. They're also working, as you know, in other countries now to bring warrants, and that's what the ICC was set up for. And Kofi Annan, our great friend of the past, did this amazing thing, didn't he, in the UN, to set up ICC, and we are hopefully soon going to be the beneficiary. I think regional agencies, back to our Afghan friend, hugely important, actually more important to humanitarian diplomacy than currently seen, because they have leverage, they have information, they have access, and they need to get in line. You know, Pakistan, back to the Afghanistan situation, needs to actually be helpful on Afghanistan. It's a complicated problem at the moment, but that I think what we're saying is, number one, we need regional leverage, we need regional understanding, we need to talk to them, which we don't enough, and then we need to leverage it. Secondly, there's no question, I think, I know it's perhaps a polemical point, that regional organizations, the African Union, ASEAN, I'm not sure about the EU, are there for purpose. They have lots of problems. Funding is irregular and insufficient, but they have legitimacy, especially now when the UN is perhaps not as much legitimate as it used to. So I was at a meeting the other day in which that point was firmly made by a former UN colleague. We need to look for them. Now we have a history of trying that. You worked for one of them, I think, Mr. McNamara, the AU. And it was a complicated issue, wasn't it? So we need to help them come through with our values and their values. Their values need to shape us, ours need to shape them.
Thanks, Martin. So I'm conscious that that we are grilling you quite intensively.
No, that's okay.
So I'm going to do another round of comments in the room, and then another round of comments online, and then I think we'll probably wrap up. I'll see what the appetite is. So, Madam, I have you at the back first, and then I have the gentleman here, and then Pata. So that's three. So.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening. I really admire you because you're one of the only emergency relief coordinators in my memory that has spoken about decolonization of humanitarian aid. Some examples that come to mind, I think it was mentioned by one of my peers, is how we saw disparities in the funding of different crises. So like Ukraine was very heavily funded, whereas like protracted crises like Central African Republic, DRC, continue to remain underfunded. Another one is that just a lot of resentment by local staff, because many times the people that are leading them are from Western countries and have far less experience and qualifications. So I was wondering, in your experience, what does decolonization actually look like? What methods work best and what work needs to be done? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sir. They're not getting easier, are they?
Yeah, they're not.
I'm Aryan. I'm Aryan from Afghanistan. I'm an IDS, I'm an IDS native student. I think it's not just my question. A lot of my peers and my classmates were truly passionate to work in humanitarian sectors to alleviate this suffering. And for me, myself, the big question is how we could enter within the UN. And because I don't have any connections, any contacts, any platform to work with the UN and work on an international platform, what would be your suggestion on how we could achieve these jobs, or maybe
take my job?
Thank you.
Thank you, Pata.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to this question of leverage. It's about who listens to the advocacy of the humanitarian principles. It's like there's this gearbox between what you might be able to hear and who it is that should be hearing it and who isn't. And, this kind of advocacy has been going on for a long time, and it seems to be slipping backwards rather than forwards. So on the basis of my experience, where I've seen that, what I would say is that most aid, humanitarian aid in particular, and most of the silences around the hypocrisy and the complicity and so on, and the apparent apolitical, politicized humanitarian aid, most of that is actually fueling the very situation that we're in now. And then on the other hand, if you look around you, most of the aid that is given to people when they're in trouble is given by their own communities and their own people, and that most of the principles, or the highest principles, you might say, of humanitarianism actually reside within community. You know, if you spend time in community and you say, what are you doing and why are you doing it? You'll hear your humanitarian principles of independence and neutrality and so on. And so if that's all true, then the question of leverage comes in. It's a naive thing. I work on it. I work on this question of listening. But I was just wondering, what can the South do to get this leverage? What can local organizations and local people do in the light of these huge power structures that are sort of getting in the way of any sort of change? Is there something like an ICC that the South could build? For example, Stephen Devereux, he came up with an idea, I don't know how far it went, that, you know, there would be a legal redress for famine. And yet I don't think there is still. I think, you know, you can be the cause of famine. Nothing happens. You can be the failed humanitarian. Nothing happens. So I'm just wondering about ICCs for the South. Thank you.
Okay, that's easy. Yeah, I'm fed up with the famine. I mean, I agree with you, right? I mean, I'm fed up with the famine discussion because it's so difficult. I mean, declaring it seems an absolute nightmare. I think the structure of the technical committee is not fit for purpose. You know, why are we always saying famine-like conditions? Well, actually, people starving. You know, this stuff, and it is an obstacle to accountability. You know, it took, what is it? I think Sudan was the first place where the committee declared famine since 2017 or something. Oh, you know, it's not as if people have had a good life in intervening years. Gaza never quite made famine. You know, you know, interestingly, in Gaza, by the way, is a different thing. When aid was delivered in one of those small periods of aid actually getting in, the degree of survival, of nutrition, of, you know, impact on mortality was huge immediately, because food got to people, nutrition and health, you know. So there's a clear evidence-based reason why you do this. I agree with you, advocacy is not working, and I agree with you, and I'll come to maybe suggesting something. In my experience the last 3 or 4 years, I started in Mekelle back in 2021, and then I went, you know, to all these other places. Burkina Faso was a particular place of importance for me about this issue. In every single place, it is completely true and valid and proper that it is the local communities who step in first. We're a bit slow. They bankrupt themselves to help these unexpected neighbors. And it's not monetized, of course. So it's not aid. It's their, you know, it's their humanity. And what we see in all these places, and I wrote about the situation in Djibo in Burkina Faso, where the mothers crossed the lines of conflict with Al-Qaeda to get leaves for their new neighbors because there was no food left. This is humanity. This is a reminder that whatever we see in our political leaders, frankly, across the world, the people, us actually, have not lost the sense of humanity. It's a deep, deep well. What we haven't done is, about leverage, we're not kind of leveraging this, right? We're not taking this into account. We're frightened of advocacy because of all the retaliation, threats, and so forth. And we don't study it enough, obviously Lewis and IDSs, to see how we can leverage that. That's the best corroboration we have for what we're trying to do. And we shouldn't walk away from it. We should do the solidarity which comes with that. How to enter the UN? Yeah. Good luck. I don't know why you want it, but anyway, because it's great. Yeah, it is difficult, isn't it? And I think now the UN, correct me if I'm wrong, they had a hiring freeze across the agencies because, you know, funding cuts, and they're laying off people, so it's a bad time. But I agree with you about the problem of getting into the work stream. It's even more true about mediation, where it's a nightmare. I got involved in mediation because I set it up myself and started doing it because nobody else would have taken me. And we started doing it in different places and we had experience. Humanitarian operations in my early days, post Sussex, was easy to get into. I was a UNICEF volunteer at the age of 23 because they took people who the British volunteer program didn't want, you can imagine. So it was easy. It's not easy now, but I'm happy to correspond with you about this and to see what we can do, because it needs people to help individuals. Decolonization. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your kind words. I'm Welsh, so I've been colonized for 1200 years by the English, and there may be some of you in this room. So I know about colonization. I want to actually address this in a public meeting of ambassadors from different countries, including the United Kingdom. My family fought yours in the year 1100 AD, and we lost, and we're still lost. So I get it. I know I'm not serious, obviously, but I understand the issue of decolonization in some sense, personally. I understand it passionately when it comes to the patronizing issue of aid. I understand it particularly when it comes to the diverting and compromising issue of political instrumentalism. We see it so clearly now. I understand it particularly when it comes to Ukraine, as you said. Ukraine was very well funded, Sudan down the drain. Syria was 30% funded. Now it's a nice, important new place. It's probably going to get more money. So it's very clear, the figures do not lie. A colleague of mine, Sophia Sprechman, who is the former Secretary General of CARE International, is from Uruguay, has been very passionate about this in recent weeks when we've been talking together. What would decolonization look like? It's actually something which would feed, I think, quite well, Lewis, into our discussions, because we need to depersonalize it and make it a current issue, right? We need to make it part of our values. I'm not sure the word decolonization is going to work very well in some countries, wherever we are, but I think the issue is really, really important. When I was in Action Aid, we did a values survey of what our values were. This was 30 years ago. And it came down to the fact that, are we a charity or are we solidarity? Charity because that's kind of colonizing. Solidarity because it's equal and proper. A huge debate in the organization. I can't remember which. I did come down on the right side, I think. Yeah. So it's another issue, isn't it, for us? Yeah.
Very good. So I'm just going to take 3 online, and then I'm going to close it. Is it really important?
Well, I think it is.
Of course. Yeah. All right. I'm going to take 3 online, or maybe give you a little one, and then we're going to close.
Okay. This is from Najiba. Why is humanitarian diplomacy failing in Gaza? And this is from Ozala. Do you foresee the possibility of introducing and promoting humanitarian studies in the global south? And finally, can you please share a real example of a successful political mediation through humanitarian diplomacy?
Just for one, of course.
And then you, sir. Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll do the 3 online. We'll do 3 in the room, and then we're going to close it, because otherwise we risk exhausting ourselves and Martin. So,
yeah, I need a drink.
Yeah. Me too. So take these 3. We'll go through 3, and then we'll close.
Let's see. So an example. The last one is an example of any success on humanitarian. Yeah. Okay. So the first one, HD, humanitarian diplomacy failing in Gaza, which of course it is. I mean, we got a blockade. There's no good things going on in Gaza. There's transactionalism at a new high level, which is discriminating against the needs and rights of people. And humanitarian diplomacy is just a fancy new name, in a sense, for actually protecting and empowering the rights of people through advocacy, through negotiation. I think what's happening in Gaza is a poster boy, because the mediation in Gaza is driven by member states, obviously, US, Qatar, and Egypt in particular. I've said before that I don't think the US is a mediator in Gaza because it's coming with specific interests and leverage. Maybe that's a good thing. We'll see, you know. But it's not the same as mediation as I understand it. I think Qatar and then, in a different sense, Egypt have actually done well, but under huge criticism. Every time there's no deal, as we've seen recently, they're criticized for a failure to get Hamas to do what they tell them. I've never been in a situation where a mediator can force a party to do what they tell them. I've never been in a situation where you trust a party either, by the way. You know, they're all out for their gains and their interests, and we need to understand that. So humanitarian diplomacy is a sideshow, I would say, in Gaza. It's really important, and my former colleagues in Gaza and in the occupied territories are, of course, as Tom Fletcher recently said, my guys are doing a wonderful job. The agencies, huge. The local organizations, massive. But they're tinkering with the consequences of an unruly occupying power. And that makes it very difficult because it has the support of one of the so-called mediators. Humanitarian studies in the Global South, definitely. Actually, that's a priority. And then we were talking about this earlier. And I was talking to the Qatari government about this in the last couple of days as a kind of channel to the governments in the Global South and with their own ambitions and huge aid program and lots of mediation. It must be in the Global South. It really must be. If it's a northern and western enterprise, we ain't going to go anywhere. We have to move it on from there. I live in Geneva, but it doesn't make me Swiss. It makes me international, I hope, Welsh. So we need to move it from there to where we need it to be. And we still haven't understood the process which would validly engage with the valid opportunities and represent the Global South, because we don't really understand it. Lots of commentary, but as far as I'm aware, no real process. Hugely important. A success, well, they're few and far between, but the Black Sea grain deal, you expect me to say, was a mediation I was involved in, of course, which was successful until the Russians pulled out of it, as a means of increasing global welfare. The rationale for it, because it was obviously a political deal between enemies, both of which benefited from it in different ways, as you need to do in an agreement. But it was valid and justified because their base could be told, don't worry, we're not accommodating the enemy, we're doing the best for the world. There's so much more opportunity to do that globally. And one of the things I think, Lewis, is to actually do an audit, not too brilliant and clever and long, but an audit of those opportunities. Where are there things that we could do for humanitarian purposes in the cusp of political mediation to help people even in war? That, I think, is huge. I'm not aware of anywhere that's doing that in a systematic way at the moment. I was with the World Food Programme and their board 2 or 3 weeks ago, talking to them about this. They're just embracing this concept of humanitarian diplomacy, and they want to know where it will work, like the questioner said to Gary.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, so last 3 questions. I'm going to go, oh gosh, no, that's more than 3 people, isn't it? That's really confusing. So you, sir, because you had your hand up before, you, sir, at the very back, sorry, and then
me.
No. Madam, also at the very back.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for the talk. My name is Yahya. I'm from Syria. I'm studying at the Institute of Development Studies. I worked with the humanitarian agencies for 8 years in Syria, in the Norwegian Refugee Council, Oxfam, some project with UNDP, ICRC. I know all the agencies. And even before the US cut, a lot of the agencies wasn't very successful in reaching their objectives. Humanitarian personnel was killed in Gaza. UN peacekeepers were attacked in Lebanon. So my question is, now we have the cut fund, the defunding. And a lot of people are asking, where should the money come from now? I'm asking, why bother trying to fix a system that wasn't reaching its objectives and doesn't have a lot of power to push? And maybe we should find a new system in a way. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I am Munira, a first-year student from Nigeria. It was an honor listening to you. I have a question. I am curious about the ongoing crisis going in Gaza and how we see the Israel people, how they blocked aid to the Gaza people. So what do you think the UN should do about it, or what are they doing about it? Thank you.
Yeah. Gentleman in the far back there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alban Webb from Faculty of Media Arts and Humanities. I was very struck by what you said at the very beginning about publicity driving values. Publicity driving values, yeah, and publicity driving the process. And I just wanted to ask a question about that mediated process and how it influences the ability of humanitarian aid to do what it needs to do. There's lots of ways you could examine that. But I was particularly interested on the influence of mediation as a homophone, a different kind of mediation, as a socio-technical media knowledge system, and how that influences public understanding and the function of humanitarian aid. It's become such an overt battleground that seems to be damaging its core function and capability. Is that a new world that we've entered into, and is that here to stay? And if that's the case, do we need to find a different conceptual language and grammar with which to re-articulate humanitarian aid for the digital mediated world in the 21st century?
Right. I'm actually going to squeeze on a couple more questions because we are going to cut. So you, sir, and then you, sir, and then we're done. Sorry.
Hi, Martin. I was in Yemen when you were the special envoy, and then I was in Afghanistan when you were ERC over there. And third time's a charm, we're here. So just to keep it light.
So you know things that I don't.
I think we know things kind of on the same wavelength, but a similar, very basic, straightforward question, away from all the doom and gloom. But keeping in line with the core principles that you mentioned about mediation and humanitarian diplomacy, your office in OCHA in Yemen did a fantastic job. I think one of the questions earlier was asked, can you provide an example of how humanitarian diplomacy has worked? And I think your office did an outstanding job because I was based in Marib, and we had governorates around us that were besieged by Ansarullah. And I think with the leadership of OCHA, we had a humanitarian corridor that was created where essential medical supplies, nutrition was provided. So I think that is just an answer to the earlier question. But again, back to mediation, the humanitarian corridor seemed to really work in Yemen. Obviously, we know Ansarullah are very hard-lined. They're difficult to deal with, probably from your experience as well, as you maybe can expand on that. But just two questions, if you don't mind, just a two-parter. Number one, humanitarian corridor, is that possible in Palestine? In that context, obviously, greater vested interests are at play, but we've seen it work, and Ansarullah, they gave it a chance, and it worked. And it was, again, a success story for humanitarianism all around the world. Read about it, fantastic job that they did. So thank you for that. I was there, and everyone, all the Yemenis were so grateful for that because it was actually humanitarian work being done. Number two, you've also worked in Afghanistan with the Taliban. In short and in brief, Ansarullah and Taliban using mediation, humanitarian diplomacy, lessons learned?
Right. And then you get the very last question, sir, and then we're going to run over time. So this gentleman in front here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to pick up on the issue that was raised about local people and their sense of humanity. We've seen it in Southport here in Britain, the way that people quickly made donations to build memorials for the 3 little girls. But I have to be pedantic. When we say people, there are different classes of people, and the people that worry me most are the military and the arms dealers. And we don't talk about those. They're the ones that are feeding arms in and making profits. That's got to be part of any solution.
Great. All right. So 5 really straightforward questions for today just to finish on.
The last one's about the end.
Yeah, and you've got about 3 minutes.
Funding, why bother for Syria? Because people need it. You know, you have to go with what you've got, as well as having a vision. I spent a lot of time, you probably know that, with Mr. Assad, for example, particularly 2023 after the earthquakes. And he eventually said, after a lot of meetings, he said, I'm fine now. Because the Arab League has, welcomed me to Jeddah. You don't have to do anything. And the result of that was he was just, thrown out, right? The classic example of a refusal to do the minimum of dialogue. He obviously was a weird guy. But, so I think a bad system may be better than no system while we reform the bad system. But you know better. You know better. I'm on the NRC board now, by the way, so I'll be watching. Gaza blockage and blockade, clearly absolutely reprehensible. It's against all kinds of laws, international humanitarian law, occupied powers law. It's an offence to our conscience. It's completely wrong, and it's wrong to be both implemented by Israel and supported by the United States and maybe other countries. I think your question was, what do we do about this, wasn't it? What do we say about it? And the UN has been careful, let me put it that way, because of course they're doing Security Council debate, I think yesterday was it, on Syria. Was a bit equivocal about this. Humanitarian leaders, as we said earlier, are a bit careful. I was asked to go on the BBC radio, actually, it's going to be yesterday, to comment on David Lammy criticizing the power of Israel. And I thought, that's not a question. It's obvious. He's right. If you start with that, it's obviously right. Good thing at last. And so I think the Gaza blockade, which is part of a failed mediation, isn't it? A contorted mediation, tells us that we need to do mediation properly, and we need to condemn properly, and we need to have no tolerance. It's not clever to wait for answers for later. That's what I learned on Gaza these many, many months. Publicity driving values. It's interesting this, because I think it's right. If I look at Ukraine and the mediation that we've been seeing in the last, weeks, and I have a little bit of insight into it from my time in the Black Sea, it's been a terrible example of going to the press first. Including, by the way, in this country, I think, where I think President Putin came out with some I don't know if they're conditions, but propositions. Every party does, by the way, going into a possible thing, and some of them were necessary to have a successful ceasefire. And he, obviously, on the side of Ukraine throughout this, was accused of not being serious. Well, maybe he's just expressing his views, and we need to negotiate it. And I think what's happening now, as I understand it from the inside, is that there is a change in the way this is going to be managed. The change should be about confidence building measures, Black Sea trade, energy infrastructure, and so forth. And we will do this together. This is not the way to do a mediation. You do not, of course you have bilateral meetings with each party, but you don't do it like it's done in Saudi Arabia, a big one with one party and a small one with the other. You don't do it shouting at the party, clearly. I mean, that's kind of common ground, isn't it? It's anathema. And you listen, not shout. That's the main thing. But this is a new world. But But I think the idea, we learnt it first in Colombia, I think, actually, many, many years ago, that the idea of having the megaphone to drive events is seriously unhelpful for any negotiation. I mean, in business, in politics, in conflict mediation. And it's wrong. We should shut up. Kofi Annan had a lovely phrase, which he used to tell us. He said, he just lost the opportunity to shut up. I think that's right. Yemen, humanitarian corridors, there was good work in Yemen, wasn't there? I mean, it was serious. And OCHA and the coordinators inside Sana, not me, were really, really key to that. And it shows humanitarian diplomacy, you're absolutely right. Of course it should happen elsewhere. The agencies have been trying to do that in Sudan for these many, many months without success. Corridors in war is not a new idea. We have Operation Lifeline Sudan from 40 years ago, but vital. It means that, and the humanitarians will always say this, even in war, we can achieve our objectives. You know, ICRC, really importantly, and I learned it finally, says we don't ask for ceasefires, we ask for aid, and it's passive, don't we? It's a very powerful point because it's an obligation, it's a right, and we will do that. We don't need to go into the end of war stuff to deliver our aid. I think we can do it in Gaza if there was a slight opportunity provided by the powers that be. We tried to do it. We had humanitarian corridors. We talked about airdrops coming in from Jordan. Sigrid Kaag was trying to, that was her job. It's obviously needed. One of the big problems in Gaza always was that you need to demine the routes as well as provide an entry to the trucks and get rid of the criminalization as a Taliban and Ansarallah. It's a good question. I found Ansarallah, who I spent a lot of time with, a very, very, very nice people. You know, you'd be surprised how nice people in that job are. Very difficult to deal with, very transactional. Remember this. Taliban, charming, unless you're a woman in Afghanistan, and really much more difficult to deal with on a fundamental level. You know, see the way the edicts have gone. There's been no change in the last 3 years. We need to pay attention to that, and I hope that we can do something about that. But it's fascinating, the psychology of armed groups. I started with the Khmer Rouge, we had the PKK, the Taliban, we had ETA, you know, in this continent, is a fascinating subject of itself. Okay. What's it like to be a terrorist in Europe, for example? And I've got a few ideas on that for you, but I think that's an area where the humanitarian diplomats and mediation diplomats and political diplomats need to share these insights. Remember in Burundi, many, many years ago, 25 years ago, we always said, you remember, we always said it's the doctor, the medical doctor to the head of state, which is the key person. I think CIA probably had a link. You know, give us more doctors. Thank you.
Arms dealers?
Oh, arms dealers, great people. Any support given? You know, these are not my people. Obviously very important and this and that, but we're fighting an uphill battle everywhere, especially now, as we discussed today, against the flow. And the huge investment, almost certainly justified, but it's not my field. I was a pacifist, of course, here in Sussex all these years ago, is not to actually pay too much attention to it. But there is a defense to Europe, you know, you know, everybody says so. I don't think there's much to be done in cooperation with these different, let's call them communities in our places of crisis. You know, we need to understand them. We probably need to talk to them like we talk to members saying we talk to bad people everywhere. You know, Mr. Assad and everybody else. Probably them too, why not? Because we need to understand what they're hearing. We don't understand their sources of information, intelligence. Really important, but they're not our allies.
So, incredible thanks. I don't think any of us can say thank you enough. That was a big old grilling, wasn't it? Yeah, you did very well.
Another 40 years.
So can we say thank you to Martin? Yeah. Once again, a deep privilege, and I think we're all reminded of the values that we have to defend. So thank you for that.